The year was 1887, and the dust of the high plains had settled into every line on Caleb Prescott's face. It was a fine, gritty sediment that spoke of drought, of loss, and of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical part of him. His ranch, a spread of parched land and sun-bleached wood that had once echoed with the laughter of a wife and the small, bright sounds of a son, was now a monument to silence. The wind that swept down from the mountains howled through the eaves of the cabin, not with the promise of rain, but like a thing grieving alongside him. Caleb had inherited the silence 3 years prior, delivered by the same fever that stole Martha and little Daniel from the world, leaving him the sole keeper of their memory. He worked from before the sun bled over the eastern rim of the world until long after it bruised into nightfall, driven by a need to exhaust his body so thoroughly that his mind had no energy left to wander down the shadowed paths of what used to be. He was a man hollowed out, going through the motions of living in a place where life had become a ghost. It was the failing pump that forced him into the settlement of redemption. The town was a misnomer, a clutch of raw timbered buildings that offered little more than whiskey, overpriced supplies, and the judging eyes of men who saw Caleb's grief not as a wound, but as a weakness. He avoided it whenever possible, preferring the honest cruelty of the land to the veiled contempt of its inhabitants. But the last of his cattle were lowing with a thirst he could no longer ignore, so he rode in on his aging mare, his jaw set and his gaze fixed on the door of the general store. As he was tying the reins, a commotion spilled from the saloon. Laughter, sharp and ugly, cut through the afternoon haze. At the center of the gathering was Garrett Vance, a man whose wealth was as new as his manners were old and foul. He stood beside a horse that took Caleb's breath away. It was a stallion, a magnificent paint with a coat like spilled cream and patches the color of wet earth. But its beauty was marred by a wildness born of terror. Its eyes rolled, white and frantic, and long, weeping scars tracked across its flanks and chest, a testament to a brutal hand. A rope was cinched cruelly tight around its neck, held by one of Garrett's hired men. "He's broken, I tell you," Garrett boasted, his voice thick with liquor. "Spirit's gone, but he won't let a man on his back. Too stubborn, too much wild blood." Standing a few feet away, her expression as still and unreadable as a stone carving, was a native woman. She was Cheyenne, that much was clear from the beadwork on her worn buckskin dress. Her black hair was braided, and her face, though etched with a quiet weariness, held a defiant beauty that seemed to rebuke the dusty ugliness of the town. She stood with a stillness that was not passive, but potent, as if she were the eye of the storm raging around her. Her gaze was fixed on the terrified horse, a flicker of something pain, kinship passing through her dark eyes. Garrett followed Caleb's gaze. "Ah, you see the rest of the bargain. She came with the beast, won them both in a card game from a trapper who'd lost his nerve. He said she's the only one who can handle him. Calls her a horse whisperer. I call her a silent savage." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. She did not flinch. The men laughed. Caleb felt a slow, cold anger begin to uncoil in his gut. It was an unfamiliar feeling, a flicker of life in the deadened landscape of his heart. He saw the horse, saw its panic and its pain, and he saw the woman, treated as little more than a piece of tack that came with the animal. Garrett, sensing a new focus for his sport, turned on Caleb. "What's the matter, Prescott? See something you like? A man like you, all alone out on that dust bowl you call a ranch. You could use a strong back, both of them." "The horse is mistreated," Caleb said, his voice rusty from disuse. "It's a broken thing," Garrett sneered. "Just like its keeper, just like some folks I know." The insult was clear, aimed squarely at Caleb's solitary life. "Tell you what, I'm tired of looking at it. I'll bet the animal. Your saddle against the horse." Caleb looked at his saddle. It was his last truly fine possession, a gift from his father, the leather worn to a soft gleam, the silver conchos a dull shine. It was worth more than he had to his name. The men around them murmured, sensing the shift in the air. "What's the wager?" Caleb asked, the words tasting strange in his mouth. Garrett grinned, a predator's smile. You see that fence post at the end of the street? If you can get that beast to walk to it and back, calm as you please, you win him. But you can't use a whip or a spur, just your hands and your voice. He glanced at the woman. And you can't use her. It was an impossible bet. The horse was a knot of pure fear. But Caleb had grown up with horses. His father had taught him that you don't break a horse's spirit, you earn its trust. He looked at the stallion's trembling flanks, the foam on its lips, and felt a pull, a sense of shared brokenness. I'll take the bet, Caleb said, the decision settling in him with a surprising solidity. He walked slowly toward the horse, ignoring the jeers and the bets being laid by the onlookers. He didn't look at Garrett or the other men. He looked only at the animal. He spoke in a low, steady murmur, the same tone he had used to soothe Daniel when he woke from a nightmare. He didn't try to touch the horse, not at first. He just stood near its head, speaking of water, of open pastures, of a gentle hand. He moved with a patience he thought he had lost forever, a quiet deliberateness that slowly began to penetrate the horse's wall of terror. The stallion's ears, which had been pinned back, flickered. Its frantic breathing began to slow. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb reached out a hand, not toward the horse's head, but to the cruelly tight rope. He worked the knot with slow, careful fingers, never breaking his soft monologue. The rope fell away. The horse shuddered, but did not bolt. Caleb then turned and began to walk, slowly, toward the distant fence post. He didn't look back. He just walked, his belief in the wager a fragile, flickering thing. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The horse, after a moment's hesitation, took a step. Then another. It followed him, its head low, its gait still uncertain, but it followed. It walked with him to the post, stood while he touched it, and then followed him back. A dead silence fell over the street. Caleb stopped before Garrett, his heart pounding not with victory, but with a strange, aching kind of hope. Garrett's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. He threw the lead rope onto the ground. The horse is yours, Prescott, he snarled. And so is she, a matched pair of broken things for your broken ranch. He gestured contemptuously at the Cheyenne woman. Get her out of my sight. Caleb looked at the woman. For the first time, her eyes met his. They were not vacant or defeated. They were deep and dark and filled with a fierce, guarded intelligence. She was watching him, weighing him. He felt a flush of shame so profound it was dizzying. He hadn't won a horse. He had become complicit in the buying and selling of a human being. The journey back to the ranch was steeped in a silence more profound than any Caleb had ever known. The woman, whose name he did not know, walked with a fluid grace a few paces behind him as he led the nervous stallion. He had offered her his mare to ride, but she had refused with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The refusal was not an act of submission, but of assertion. She would not ride his horse. She would walk on her own 2 feet. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft sound of her moccasins on the dry earth, a counterpoint to the heavy tread of his boots and the clop of the horse's hooves. He tried to think of something to say, but the words felt like stones in his throat. What could he say? I'm sorry you were part of a drunken bet. Welcome to my desolate home where you are now, a prisoner of my supposed victory. Every thought was inadequate, insulting. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the desolate landscape in strokes of heartbreaking beauty. The silence of the place rushed out to meet them, the silence he had curated for 3 years. Now, it felt different. It was no longer just his own, it was shared, and her part of it felt heavier, more ancient and wronged than his own. He gestured toward the small, lean-to room that had been his workshop. It was sparse, but it had a cot and was protected from the elements. You can stay in there, he said, his voice rough. It's dry. She looked at the lean-to, then at the barn where he was unsaddling his mare. Her gaze was level. She said nothing, but he understood. He was offering her shelter better than the barn, a distinction he hadn't been required to make. It was the smallest of gestures, a fragile seed of decency planted in the toxic soil of their meeting. She gave a single, brief nod and went inside, pulling the rough burlap curtain across the doorway. The first week was a study in observation and distance. Caleb rose at dawn and worked until dusk, his movements dictated by the endless, grinding needs of the ranch. He found that his solitude was gone, replaced by a constant, unnerving awareness of another person in his space. He would be mending a fence and feel her eyes on him from the doorway of the cabin. He would be drawing water from the well, and he would see her standing by the corral, watching the paint stallion. She never spoke. She ate the food he left for her on a plate outside her door, and the plate would be returned, cleaned, to the same spot. She moved with a quiet purpose that unnerved him. She was not waiting to be told what to do. She was watching, learning, assessing. The stallion was their first point of connection, though they never spoke of it. Caleb had put him in the largest corral, providing fresh water and hay, but keeping his distance. The horse remained wild with fear, pacing the fence line, his scarred hide twitching at every sound. On the third day, Caleb saw her slip into the corral. She didn't carry a rope or a bridle. She just stood in the center, her stillness a rebuke to the horse's panic. She began to hum, a low, guttural melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The horse stopped pacing. It turned its head, its ears twitching. For days she did this. She would spend hours in the corral, sometimes humming, sometimes just standing, a calm anchor in the horse's sea of fear. Slowly, miraculously, the stallion began to change. He would stand quietly while she was there. Then he began to approach her, sniffing her outstretched hand. By the end of the week, he was allowing her to touch his face, to run her hands over the terrible scars on his neck. Caleb watched from a distance, mesmerized. She was not breaking the horse. She was healing it. She was offering it a peace it had never known, and the animal was responding in kind. One afternoon, Caleb was splitting logs for the stove, his mind wandering. The axe was old, the handle worn smooth. His thoughts drifted to Martha, to the easy way she had filled their home with life. The grief came upon him suddenly, a physical blow that buckled his knees. He leaned against the chopping block, the axe slipping from his grasp, and the sharp blade sliced a deep gash across the back of his hand. He swore, wrapping the wound with his handkerchief, but the blood soaked through it almost immediately. He headed for the cabin to find a clean rag, his head down. As he passed her doorway, the burlap curtain was pulled aside. She stood there, her dark eyes on his bleeding hand. Before he could react, she stepped out, took his wrist with a surprising firmness, and examined the cut. Her touch was not rough, but it was decisive. She led him to the water pump and gestured for him to wash the wound. The cold water stung, but he did as he was implicitly told. Then she disappeared, not into her room, but toward the sparse, dry creek bed behind the cabin. She returned minutes later with a handful of broad, gray-green leaves. She crushed them between two stones, creating a pulpy mash which she applied carefully to the gash. It felt cool and soothing. Then she tore a strip from the hem of her own worn dresser sacrifice that struck him silent and bound his hand with a skill that spoke of long practice. He stood there, mute, as she finished tying the knot. The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the scent of crushed herbs and the weight of her unexpected care. "Thank you," he said. The words were wholly inadequate. She looked at his face, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Vivina," she said. Her voice was low and clear, like water running over smooth stones. It was the first time she had offered him a piece of herself. "Caleb," he replied, feeling foolish for not having introduced himself sooner. She nodded, as if accepting this small exchange as a treaty. Then she turned and walked back toward the corral, where the stallion watched her, waiting. Caleb looked at his bandaged hand. The bleeding had stopped. For the first time in 3 years, someone had tended to one of his wounds. The sharing of her name, Vivina, and the tending of his hand marked a subtle but profound shift in the climate of the ranch. The hard frost of mistrust began to thaw, slowly, around the edges. Caleb stopped leaving her food on the porch like an offering to a wild spirit and instead began to set a second place at the rough-hewn table inside the cabin. The first time he did it, she hesitated at the threshold, her eyes questioning. "It's warmer in here," he mumbled, feeling the heat rise in his own neck. She entered and sat, her posture erect, her silence still a shield, but she was there. Their first meals together were exercises in quietude, the only sounds the scrape of forks on plates and the sighing of the wind outside. But gradually, the silence became less a void and more a shared space. It was a language of its own, built on mutual observation. She noticed the way he always paused before eating, a ghost of a prayer for a family no longer there. He noticed the way she saved a small piece of her bread, taking it out to the corral for the stallion later. He learned the stallion's name one evening as he watched her with the horse. The animal's coat was beginning to regain its luster, and the fear in its eyes had been replaced by a deep, abiding trust in her. It nudged her shoulder gently as she groomed it with a brush Caleb had left on the fence. "He's a good horse," Caleb said, approaching the corral slowly. Vivina didn't turn. "His name is Wovoka," she said. "Wovoka," Caleb repeated. "What does it mean?" She turned to look at him then, the setting sun catching the high planes of her cheekbones. "It means, he who makes sea." The words settled in the air between them, heavy with a meaning Caleb was only just beginning to understand. Wovoka. The horse wasn't just being healed, he was a conduit for sight, forcing Caleb to see beyond the grime of redemption, beyond the brutishness of Garrett Vance, and to see the woman who stood before him. He was beginning to see Vivina. Their conversations started as small, practical things. She would point to the sky and say a single word in Cheyenne, a word for a certain type of cloud that promised rain. He, in turn, would explain the workings of the stubborn pump, how to coax it into life. She showed him which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, and which plants could be made into a tea that eased the ache in his weary bones. He showed her how to mend a leather harness, the rhythmic work of the awl and thread a meditation he had learned from his father. Slowly, pieces of their pasts began to surface, offered up like rare, fragile gifts. He found himself talking about Martha, not the pain of her loss, but the joy of her presence. He spoke of her laugh, of the garden she had managed to coax from the unforgiving soil. Vivina listened, her dark eyes filled with a deep, quiet empathy that asked for nothing and offered everything. One night, as a coyote called from the distant hills, she spoke of her own people. She did not speak of a massacre or a great battle, but of something slower and just as deadly. She spoke of a bad winter, of sickness, of a treaty that was a lie. She spoke of her family being scattered like seeds on a hard wind, of being taken by a trapper who saw her only as a commodity. Her story was told without self-pity, a recitation of facts that were all the more devastating for their starkness. Caleb listened, and the last of his resentment for his own lonely fate withered away, replaced by a profound and humbling shame for the world that had done this to her. His grief was a private tragedy. Hers was the wound of an entire people. He had lost his home within these walls. She had lost a whole world. The peace they were building was a fragile thing, a house of cards in a world full of harsh winds. Caleb knew it. He saw the way men from the settlement would sometimes ride out to the edge of his property, their curiosity a malevolent thing. He knew that a man like Garrett Vance did not easily forget a public humiliation. The wind came one hot, dry afternoon, not in the form of a storm, but as 3 riders cresting the hill. It was Garrett and 2 of his cronies. They rode not with purpose, but with a swaggering menace, stopping their horses just beyond the fence line. "Prescott," Garrett yelled, his voice carrying on the still air. Vivina, who had been watering Wovoka, froze. The horse sensed her tension and sidled closer to her, stamping a hoof. Caleb walked out of the cabin, his hands empty but his posture rigid. "Vance, this is private property." "I've been thinking about our bet," Garrett sneered, his eyes flicking from Caleb to Vivina and back again. "Seems to me you had an unfair advantage. You had the horse witch here to help you." His gaze on Vivina was greasy, possessive. "I think I want my property back, not the horse, the other piece." The cold anger Caleb had felt in town returned, but this time it was not a flicker. It was a hot, cleansing fire. "She is not your property. She was never your property," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The bet was for the horse. You lost. Now leave." One of Garrett's men laughed. "Listen to him. Playing protector. What's she do for you, Prescott? Keep your bed warm at night." Before Caleb could move, Vivina stepped forward. She stood beside him, her face a mask of cold fury. She did not look at Garrett, but at the man who had spoken. She said something in Cheyenne, her voice sharp and cutting as flint. The man's laugh died in his throat. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Garrett's face darkened. "You'll regret this, Prescott, both of you." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. "A man has to protect what's his. I'll be back for what's mine." They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence thick with threat. Caleb looked at Vivina. She was trembling, not with fear, but with rage. He saw in that moment the warrior spirit that had been buried beneath layers of forced stoicism. "What did you say to him?" Caleb asked quietly. Her gaze met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of a grim smile on her lips. "I told him that his spirit was coyote, small, and that he would die cold and alone, and the buzzards would not even find his bones worthy to pick clean." Caleb felt a laugh bubble up, the first real laugh he'd had in years. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound, but it was real. He had won a horse in a bet, a magnificent animal named He Who Makes Sea. But standing beside him, her spirit burning as brightly and fiercely as a prairie fire, was the woman who had taught him how to see again. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would let his own bones bleach in the sun before he let anyone harm her. The ranch was no longer just his place of grief. It was their home, and he would defend it. The threat left by Garrett Vance hung in the air like the oppressive heat before a thunderstorm. Caleb and Vivina moved through the following days with a heightened awareness, a silent accord passing between them. They were no longer just two wounded souls coexisting, they were partners in a fragile alliance, bound by a shared enemy. Caleb began carrying his father's old rifle with him as he did his chores, its weight a grim but necessary comfort. Vivina's eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, her ears tuned to any sound that was out of place. The storm broke not with thunder but with fire. It came in the dead of night, a week after Garrett's visit. A new moon hid the world in a deep, inky blackness. Caleb was woken by Wovoka's frantic whinnying, a sound of pure terror that sliced through his sleep. He sprang from his bed, grabbing the rifle, and burst out of the cabin door. The smell of smoke and burning hay hit him first. A hellish orange glow flickered against the side of the barn. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls, greedily consuming the place where he stored his meager winter supplies and where the old milking cow and her calf were sheltered. He saw 3 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the growing blaze. It was Garrett and his men. They weren't there for a confrontation, they were there for destruction, to burn him out, to destroy what little he had. "Vivina," he yelled, his voice raw with urgency. She was already there. She had emerged from her room, not in panic, but with a terrifying calm. In her hands, she held the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. Her eyes were fixed on the burning barn, on the panicked sounds of the animals trapped inside. "The cattle," she said, her voice tight. Their minds worked as one. There was no time for discussion, only action. "I'll keep them back. Get the animals out," Caleb shouted, levering a round into the rifle's chamber. He fired a shot into the air, high above the riders' heads. The crack of the rifle echoed across the plains, a stark declaration. "Get off my land!" The riders, startled by the resistance, pulled back, their laughter turning to curses. Garrett yelled an order, and one of his men raised a pistol, firing wildly toward the cabin. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Caleb's head. While their attention was on Caleb, Vivina ran, not away from the fire, but toward it. She moved like a shadow, using the flickering light and deep darkness to her advantage. She reached the large side door of the barn, the one leading to the stalls, and with a strength he never would have imagined, she heaved the heavy barred door open. Smoke and terrified lowing poured out. The cow and its calf stumbled into the night, their eyes wide with fear, but Vivina wasn't done. She darted back toward the inferno. Caleb's heart seized. He thought she was going back inside. Instead, she ran to the main corral, where Wovoka was rearing and plunging against the fence, trapped. While Caleb laid down suppressing fire, forcing Garrett's men to take cover, Vivina slipped the latch on the corral gate. Wovoka, free, galloped into the darkness of the open prairie, away from the fire and the gunfire. Garrett, enraged that their plan was falling apart, spurred his horse forward, charging directly at Caleb. "This ends now, Prescott," he roared, his face demonic in the firelight. Caleb stood his ground, raised the rifle, and took aim. But he didn't aim for Garrett. He aimed for the horse. It was a shot his father had taught him, a last resort. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the earth just in front of the charging horse's hooves. The animal screamed in terror, rearing violently and throwing Garrett from the saddle. He landed hard with a cry of pain. His two men, seeing their leader unhorsed and the fight turning against them, lost their nerve. They exchanged a panicked glance, wheeled their horses, and fled into the night, abandoning their employer. Garrett struggled to his feet, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. He stared at Caleb, his face a mask of hatred and disbelief. But his gaze shifted to Vivina, who now stood beside Caleb, the iron skillet held like a warrior's shield. He saw them standing together, united against him, framed by the defiant light of his own failed destruction. He saw not two broken things, but an unbreakable whole. Without another word, he scrambled to his fallen horse, hauled himself into the saddle with his good arm, and galloped away, a broken man disappearing into the darkness he had tried to wield as a weapon. The fire raged on, but the human threat was gone. Caleb and Vivina worked together, using buckets of precious water from the well not to save the barnet, was already lost, but to keep the flames from spreading to the cabin, to their home. They worked until their muscles screamed and their faces were black with soot, a silent, efficient team moving through the ruin. By the time the sun began to rise, the barn was a smoking skeleton of charred timbers. The fire was out. Exhausted, they stood together and surveyed the damage. The heart of the ranch's operations was gone. It was a devastating blow. Caleb's shoulders slumped. For a moment, the old despair threatened to reclaim him. All this work, all this fighting, for what? To be left with even less than before. He felt a touch on his arm. Vivina was looking at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes clear and steady in the pale morning light. She gestured with her head toward the open plains. In the distance, standing on a ridge and silhouetted against the dawn, was Wovoka, and not far from him, grazing peacefully, were the cow and her calf. They hadn't lost everything. They had saved the living things. They had saved each other. He turned to her, the smell of smoke and wet ash filling his senses. "I'm sorry," he said, the words encompassing everything. "For the bet. For how you came to be here. For all of this." She held his gaze, and her expression softened. A deep understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the long, hard road they had traveled from that dusty street in redemption. She reached out and, with her thumb, gently wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. "We are here," she said simply. It was not an accusation or a statement of fact. It was a declaration. We, In that single word, a new foundation was laid upon the ashes of the old. The fire had taken the barn, but it had forged something far stronger in its place. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began its slow rebirth. The rhythm of their lives found a new, more deeply intertwined cadence. They cleared the charred remains of the barn together, the shared labor a balm for the trauma of the fire. From the usable timbers, Caleb, with Vivina's steady help, began to construct a smaller, more practical shelter for the animals. The silence that had once defined the ranch was now filled with new sounds. The lowing of the cow, the soft nicker of Wovoka as he trotted in from the prairie each evening, and, most remarkably, the sound of their voices. They talked as they worked, their conversations weaving a tapestry of shared existence. He told her stories of his boyhood in the east, of green hills and plentiful rain. She taught him the Cheyenne names for the stars that blazed in the vast, clear night sky, telling him the legends that went with them. The hollow space in Caleb's heart, the one carved out by grief, began to fill with something new. It wasn't that the memory of Martha and Daniel faded. Rather, the sharp edges of their absence were being softened by Vivina's presence. He found himself smiling without thinking, a real smile that reached his eyes. He watched her one afternoon, her head bent as she stitched a patch onto his worn shirt, her movements deft and graceful, and he felt a wave of affection so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a quiet, gentle love, born not of sudden passion, but cultivated slowly in the hard soil of mutual respect and shared survival. She, in turn, began to let her own guard down completely. The stoic mask she had worn for protection was shed, revealing a woman of deep warmth and quiet humor. She would sometimes laugh, a low, musical sound that Caleb came to cherish more than the promise of rain. She had found a sanctuary, a place where she was not property, not a savage, but a person. A partner, a woman named Vivina. One evening, as the sky was brushed with the violet and rose of sunset, they sat on the porch of the small cabin. It wasn't the home he had planned, but it felt more real, more solid than it ever had before. Wovoka stood at the corral fence, his coat gleaming, his scars now just a faint, silvery map of a past he had survived. He was no longer a broken thing, neither were they. Caleb looked at Vivina. She was gazing out at the land, her land now as much as his, her expression one of profound peace. The life he thought had ended 3 years ago hadn't ended at all. It had been waiting for him to be brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to make a reckless bet, waiting for the arrival of a woman and a horse who would teach him how to see again. He reached over and tentatively took her hand. Her fingers were strong and calloused from work, but they curled around his, fitting perfectly. She turned her head and smiled at him, a true, open smile that held the promise of 1,000 sunsets to come. The world still held its harshness, and the land its challenges, but Caleb Prescott was no longer alone in facing them. He had been a struggling cowboy who won a broken horse in a bet. He had been a fool. He had thought the stallion was the prize, but he knew now, with every fiber of his being, that the true prize was the magnificent, resilient, beautiful woman who sat beside him, her hand in his. As they watched the day come to a quiet and perfect close, they were home.
The spear punched through flesh and buckskin with a sickening wet thud, stealing Cale's breath in a ragged, burning gasp. Agony, white-hot and immediate, exploded in his side. He felt the rough-hewn shaft vibrate with the force of the impact, felt his own blood, shockingly warm, begin to spill. The parched earth rushed up to meet him as his knees buckled, the weight of the world crashing down. Through a haze of pain, he heard a woman's scream tear through the air. Sarah. Her cry was a blade twisting in his already wounded spirit. Behind her, shielded by his collapsing body, their infant son Daniel let out a terrified wail. Arrows, like broken quills, littered the ground around them, grim decorations from the furious, desperate battle he had just waged. His fingers, slick and trembling, tightened instinctively around the worn handle of his tomahawk. He fought the encroaching darkness. He had to. For them. How had it come to this? How had a love so pure ignited such a devastating firestorm? For Cale, a warrior of the Willow Creek people, it began, as many fateful journeys do, with a path he was never meant to tread. Cale moved through the dense forest with the silence of a hunting cat, his senses alive to the snap of every twig, the rustle of every leaf. He was a man tuned to the whispers of the wild, his eyes, the color of dark river stones, missing nothing. This keenness, honed since boyhood, served him well as a provider for his tribe. But today, it served a different purpose. It guided him along a hidden game trail, one he kept deliberately obscured, leading him away from the familiar lands of the Willow Creek and towards the burgeoning, often wary settlement of Stone Creek Crossing. His destination was a small, isolated cabin, nestled deep within a sun-dappled hollow, its chimney breathing a faint plume of smoke that only a trained eye like Cale's could discern from a distance. There lived Sarah. She had arrived in Stone Creek Crossing a season past, a woman alone but for the quiet strength in her cornflower blue eyes and a resilience that seemed to defy the harshness of the frontier. She spoke little of her past, her history, a carefully guarded territory. Cale had first seen her at the settlement's trading post, her gaze meeting his with an unexpected directness, a flicker of recognition passing between two solitary souls in a crowded, often indifferent world. Their encounters, at first accidental, soon became deliberate, clandestine meetings under the vast, star-dusted sky, far from the prying eyes of her people and his. Respect blossomed into a tender, fierce love, a dangerous sanctuary in a land that rarely tolerated such unions. And then there was Daniel, their son, a tiny, perfect miracle, his innocent gurgles and soft breaths a testament to their forbidden bond, a secret joy that also amplified their peril 100-fold. Each smile from the boy, each touch of his small hand, was a precious gift Cale stored in his heart, a warmth against the encroaching chill of disapproval he increasingly felt from his own people. The winds of discontent were beginning to stir within the Willow Creek tribe. At their center was Boren, a formidable warrior whose heart seemed to have hardened alongside the calluses on his hands. Boren was a man shackled to the past, viewing the influx of settlers and their strange ways not as an inevitable tide of change, but as a poisonous blight upon the tribe's sacred traditions and ancestral lands. His voice, resonant and commanding, often filled the council lodge with fiery rhetoric, speaking of spiritual purity, of the necessity of separation, of excising any perceived weakness or contamination before it could fester and spread. He never spoke Cale's name directly in these early days, not in connection with any specific transgression. Yet Cale felt Boren's gaze follow him, cold and calculating, like the predatory stillness of a wolf before the strike. Every journey Cale undertook toward Sarah's cabin, every shared moment of fragile peace with her and Daniel became heavier, shadowed by the looming threat Boren represented. Sarah, too, bore the burden of their secret world. In Stone Creek Crossing, she navigated a path of careful civility. Most settlers were occupied with their own struggles, their own dreams of taming the wild land. But a woman living alone, with an infant son, and no apparent husband or steady male protector, inevitably drew whispers. Mrs. Albright, the stern-faced wife of the general store owner, would purse her lips with disapproval whenever Sarah came to trade her carefully tended garden vegetables for flour or salt. Her questions were always a little too pointed, her gaze lingering a moment too long on Daniel's dark hair and eyes, so like his father's. Sarah would meet these subtle inquisitions with a quiet dignity, her chin held high, but inside, a knot of anxiety would tighten. Her small cabin, their haven of love, felt increasingly like a vulnerable island in a turbulent sea, beautiful but terribly exposed. She'd taken to barring the door more firmly at night, starting at the howl of a distant coyote or the creak of a floorboard, imagining eyes watching from the tree line. The uneasy balance of their hidden life began to fracture. Boren's pronouncements in the tribal council grew more direct, his accusations sharper. He spoke now of warriors whose loyalties were divided, whose spirits were being weakened by an unnatural fascination with the settler world. He painted vivid pictures of ancestral wrath, of hunts that would fail and sicknesses that would spread if the tribe did not reaffirm its commitment to the old ways, untainted and pure. Cale listened, his expression impassive, but his gut churned with a cold dread. He knew Boren was methodically laying a snare, not just for him, but for any who dared to bridge the gap between their two hostile worlds. One late afternoon, as Cale was carefully erasing his tracks after leaving Sarah's cabin, he sensed he was not alone. He didn't break stride, didn't betray his awareness, but his hand drifted casually closer to the knife sheathed at his hip. As he rounded a copse of ancient gnarled oaks, he found Boren and two of his most ardent followers blocking the narrow path. They hadn't been hunting. Their stance was too deliberate, too confrontational. Boren's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "You wander far from the village fires, Kyle. Your feet seem to prefer these paths, the ones that lead away from your people." Kyle met his stare, his own eyes like chips of obsidian. "A man walks where he must, Boren. My loyalty to the Willow Creek people is etched in my heart, proven in battle." "Loyalty?" Boren scoffed, taking a menacing step closer. One of his companions mirrored the movement, his hand resting on the handle of his war club. "Loyalty is a straight arrow, Kyle, not a winding serpent's trail that leads into the enemy's camp. There are whispers, whispers of a divided heart. Such a heart cannot be trusted when the drums of conflict sound." The air crackled with unspoken violence. Cale could smell the aggression coming off them, the scent of stale sweat and old hatreds. He remained still, a coiled spring of readiness beneath a veneer of calm. "The only serpent here, Boren, is the one that poisons good men's minds with suspicion and fear." For a long moment, they stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a dismissive grunt, Boren gestured for his companions to step aside. "Be wary, Cale. A path walked in shadows often leads to a sudden, dark drop." Cale inclined his head, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for a breeze rustling his hair, then continued on his way. But the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. Boren was no longer content with veiled warnings. He was actively seeking confrontation. The time for caution was rapidly running out. That night, under the cold indifference of the moon, Kyle made a decision. He could not run, could not hide Sarah and Daniel forever. If Boren sought a confrontation, then a confrontation he would have. But it would be on Cale's terms, to protect what he loved, not to satisfy Boren's thirst for power. Cale intensified his vigilance. He began to fortify Sarah's cabin in subtle ways, strengthening the door, clearing brush that might offer cover to an attacker. He taught Sarah how to use the old rifle she kept above the hearth, its mechanism stiff from disuse, guiding her hands until her aim became steady, her fear giving way to a grim determination. He spent hours with Daniel, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the sound of his laughter, etching these precious moments into his soul, as if they might be his last. His internal conflict was a constant torment. His warrior instincts urged him to strike at Boren first, to eliminate the threat. But his love for Sarah, his desire to build a life, not to perpetuate cycles of violence, held him back. He sought out some of the more moderate elders, men like Hawkwinter, who had known him since he was a boy, hoping to appeal to their sense of justice, to counter Boren's poison. But Boren's influence, fueled by genuine fear of the settlers and a potent charisma, was strong. Hawkwinter listened patiently, his gaze troubled, but offered no easy solutions. "The old ways are deep roots, Cale," he'd said, his voice heavy, "and some roots grow gnarled with age and fear." Sarah, too, sensed the shift. The air around their small haven grew charged, pregnant with an unspoken dread. One morning, she found a crude symbol, a broken arrow, Boren's favored mark of warning, scratched into the earth just beyond her woodpile. Her blood ran cold. She didn't tell Cale immediately, not wanting to add to his burdens. But that night, she clung to him fiercely, her tears silent but scalding against his skin. He held her close, whispering assurances he wasn't sure he could keep, the scent of pine and wood smoke from her hair a fragile comfort against the rising tide of his own fear. His quietness, his controlled exterior, was a dam holding back a torrent of emotions, love, rage, and a profound sorrow for the impossible choices laid before him. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Boren was orchestrating a final, brutal resolution. He could feel the noose tightening. The storm broke on a cold gray morning, the sky the color of tarnished silver. Mato, a young, brave, scarcely old enough to wear warrior's paint, one who had always admired Kael's skill and fairness, sought him out at the edge of the village. Mato's face was ashen, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate loyalty that had overcome that fear. "Kael, you must listen," Mato panted, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Boren, he spoke at the fire last night. He named you. He named the settler woman and the child." The boy choked on the words. "He said you are a blight, an infection that must be burned out before it consumes us all. He has gathered warriors. They ride at dawn to her cabin. He means to cleanse the stain," he said. "He means to kill them, Kael, and drag you back in shame." Kael's heart turned to ice, then to fire. He gripped Mato's shoulder, his fingers biting into the young brave's flesh, not in anger, but with an intensity that conveyed the terrible urgency of the moment. "You did a brave thing, Mato, a true warrior's act. Go now. Do not speak of this to anyone. Be safe." As Mato disappeared into the shadows, Kael was already moving. There was no more strategy, no more weighing of options. There was only Sarah. There was only Daniel. He was a blur of motion, his long strides eating up the distance, his breath rasping in his chest, each beat of his heart a war drum counting down the few precious moments he had left. He prayed to the spirits of his ancestors, not for his own life, but for the speed and strength to stand between his beloveds and the hatred that was even now descending upon them. The first faint streaks of dawn were painting the eastern horizon with brutal strokes of orange and crimson as he finally crested the ridge overlooking Sarah's secluded hollow. And there, moving like dark specters through the mist-laden grass below, was Boren's war party. A dozen of them, perhaps more, their forms grim and purposeful, weapons glinting ominously in the nascent light. Kael's breath caught in his throat. He was one. They were many. But numbers meant nothing now. All that mattered was reaching the cabin before they did. He plunged down the wooded slope, heedless of the branches that tore at his buckskins, the stones that threatened to twist his ankles. He reached the rear of the small cabin, his chest heaving, just as Sarah, her face pale and drawn, was peering through a small gap in the shutters. Her eyes, wide with dawning terror as she spotted the approaching warriors, found his, and a flicker of desperate hope ignited within their depths. He slipped through the back door, bolting it behind him. "They're here," she breathed, her voice trembling as she clutched Daniel, who, sensing his mother's acute distress, began to whimper. "I know, my love. I know." Kael's voice was low, preternaturally calm, a rock in the surging tide of her fear. He gently took Daniel from her, pressing a swift, fierce kiss to the baby's brow, then handed him back. "Stay low, away from the door and windows. Keep him as quiet as you can." A harsh, commanding voice sliced through the morning air. "Kael, we know you are in there. Your treachery has been uncovered. You have defiled the honor of the Willow Creek people. Come out. Deliver the white woman and her half-blood spawn to us, and perhaps, for the sake of your past deeds, the elders might yet show you a sliver of mercy." It was Boren, his voice dripping with venom and self-righteous fury. Kael exchanged a long, profound look with Sarah. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but an echo of his own unwavering resolve. He touched her cheek, a fleeting caress that spoke volumes of love, of regret, of a promise he intended to keep, no matter the cost. "They will not touch you," he vowed, his voice a raw whisper. "Nor our son. I swear it." He grabbed his bow, his movement swift and sure, knocking an arrow as he moved towards a narrow firing slit he had prepared. He was a hunter, a warrior. But today, he was something more. He was a shield. "Boren!" Kael's voice rang out, sharp and defiant. carrying clearly to the warriors outside. "This woman and this child are innocent. They have wronged no one. Your quarrel is with me, and me alone. Face me if you dare." A chorus of jeering laughter was his only answer. "You, Cale? You are but one flea, easily crushed. The child is a curse upon our tribe. The woman, a white man's whore who has ensnared you. Stand aside, or your blood will water this tainted ground alongside theirs." Then the arrows began to fly. They thudded into the sturdy log walls, splintered the wooden shutters, each impact a jarring reminder of the fury outside. Cale returned fire, his shots measured and precise, each arrow loosed with a prayer and a grim purpose. A yelp of pain from beyond the cabin walls told him at least one of his shafts had found its mark. The siege had begun. The small cabin became the epicenter of a desperate, uneven battle. Cale moved like a cornered wolf, fierce and cunning, using every piece of cover, every shadow, his arrows finding gaps in the attacker's offense. But he knew it was a battle of attrition he could not win. They were too many. Their hatred was too relentless. Suddenly, amidst a brief lull in the assault, a different voice emerged from the attacking party, deeper, older, carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "Boren, hold your arrows. There has been enough. This path you tread leads only to dishonor, not to justice." Cale risked a glance through a tiny crack. His heart leaped. It was Chief Hawkwinter. The elder had ridden with Boren's party, a fact that had dismayed Cale. But now, Hawkwinter stood apart from the others, his weathered face a mask of profound conflict and dawning disapproval. Several of Boren's warriors visibly hesitated, their bows lowering slightly as they looked from their furious leader to the respected elder. Boren, incensed, whirled on Hawkwinter. "Dishonor?" Boren snarled, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "He shelters the source of our tribe's shame. He fathers an abomination. This is not honor, old man. It is a cancer that must be cut out. The spirits themselves cry out for this cleansing." Hawkwinter did not flinch. His gaze, steady and sorrowful, met Boren's fiery glare. "I have known Cale since he was but a boy who chased butterflies with a toy bow. I have seen him bleed for our people on the field of battle. I see a warrior, Boren, protecting his own blood, however you may judge it. Perhaps your spirits are deafened by your own war cries. True courage does not lie in crushing the vulnerable." Hawkwinter's eyes then found Kyle's briefly through the slit. He had seen Kyle's skill, his bravery in this impossible defense. He remembered other times Cale had chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. This was the pivot. The palpable hesitation amongst Boren's followers, Hawkwinter's courageous, unexpected defiance, it was a sliver of a chance. A fragile branch extended over a raging torrent. But Boren was a man consumed. He saw not just a transgressor in Cale, but a challenge to his authority, his worldview. And now, that challenge was being amplified by an elder he had hoped to control. His pride, a monstrous, untamed beast, reared its ugly head. Sarah, desperate for any sign of reprieve, had crept closer to the door, trying to see, to understand the shift in the confrontation. Her movement, slight as it was, caught Boren's eye. "The seed of corruption remains," Boren bellowed, his maddened gaze locking onto Sarah. He hefted his long-bladed spear, its sharpened point gleaming with malevolent promise. With a savage roar that was more animal than human, he lunged, aiming for Sarah's exposed heart. Time fractured into a million razor-sharp shards. Sarah screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, instinctively twisting to shield Daniel with her own body. Cale saw it all in that horrifying, elongated moment. Boren's brutal charge, the deadly arc of the spear, Sarah's horrified face. There was no thought, no calculation, only a primal, overwhelming imperative: love, sacrifice. With a guttural cry torn from the very depths of his soul, Cale launched himself across the confined space of the cabin. He slammed into Sarah, his momentum carrying her and the squirming, wailing Daniel towards the relative safety of the floor, away from the direct trajectory of Boren's murderous thrust. And then, the spear found its mark, not in Sarah, but in him. The impact was a sledgehammer blow, driving the air from his lungs in a choked gasp. A blinding, searing agony ripped through his side, radiating outwards in sickening waves. He looked down, his vision blurring. The dark, fire-hardened shaft of Boren's spear jutted obscenely from his ribs, the polished stone tip buried deep within him. A sudden, terrifying weakness flooded his limbs. The world began to spin, to tilt, the sounds of the cabin Sarah's frantic, sobbing cries, Daniel's terrified screams, the distant, shocked shouts of Boren's warriors fading in and out, as if carried on a swirling wind. He crumpled to his knees, his lifeblood already staining the rough-hewn floorboards a horrifying crimson. Yet even as consciousness threatened to abandon him, his warrior spirit fought on. His body, by sheer instinct, remained a shield in front of Sarah and their son. His hand, trembling violently, still clung to the handle of his tomahawk, its weight, a familiar, if fading, anchor. Boren stood panting over him, the butt of the spear still clutched in his fist, his chest heaving. A grotesque smile of savage triumph twisted his lips. So falls the great Kael, a traitor's death, for a white-skinned whore and her half-blood whelp. He wrenched the spear free with a grunt, preparing to deliver a final, killing blow, or perhaps to turn his insatiable rage back towards Sarah and the now unprotected child. "Hold!" Chief Hawkwinter's voice was a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. He strode forward, his face a storm of righteous fury and profound sorrow. He planted himself firmly between Boren's bloodlust and Kael's broken form. Several other warriors, their faces now etched with revulsion at Boren's brutality and moved by Kael's ultimate sacrifice, stepped forward to flank Hawkwinter, their weapons no longer aimed at the cabin, but implicitly at Boren himself. This is not the way of the Willow Creek people, Boren." Hawkwinter's voice shook, not with fear, but with a terrible, potent anger. He gestured towards Kael, who lay gasping in a spreading pool of his own blood, Sarah desperately trying to staunch the horrific wound with shaking hands. "This man, this Kael, has shown a courage, a love so profound that your hate-filled heart cannot even begin to comprehend it. He has spilled his precious blood, not in defiance of our sacred traditions, but in glorious defense of innocence. There will be no more killing here today. This desecration ends now." Boren stared, his eyes wide and wild, from Hawkwinter to the warriors, who now stood resolutely with the elder. He saw the condemnation in their eyes, the shame reflecting his own actions. His moment of triumph had shattered, replaced by the bitter ashes of disgrace. He was alone, his authority irrevocably broken by Kael's selfless act and Hawkwinter's moral courage. With a strangled cry of incoherent rage, Boren threw down his bloodied spear and stumbled away, disappearing into the forest like a wounded, discredited animal. Hawkwinter knelt beside the gravely wounded Kael, his weathered face etched with pain and a deep, newfound respect. "He lives," the elder murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "but the spirits hold him by a slender thread." He looked at Sarah, her face streaked with tears and Kael's blood, her eyes pleading. "Your man, woman. He is a warrior of true heart. His spirit is stronger than the mountain stone. He has bought your lives with a price few would be willing to pay." The days that followed were a desperate, whispered battle against the encroaching shadows of death. Sarah, under the protective watch of Hawkwinter and two of his most trusted warriors, tended Kael night and day in their small, blood-stained cabin. The spear had pierced deep, narrowly missing his heart but tearing through muscle and lung. Fever became his constant companion, his strong body racked with delirium and pain. But Sarah's love was a potent medicine. Her knowledge of healing herbs, learned from a grandmother wise in the old ways of her own distant people, combined with Kael's own indomitable will to live for her and Daniel, began, slowly, miraculously, to tip the scales. Boren was never seen again in the lands of the Willow Creek. His name became a whispered shame, a cautionary tale of how ambition and hatred could twist even a strong warrior into a monster. Chief Hawkwinter, his own spirit reawakened by Kael's sacrifice, began to speak with a new wisdom in the tribal councils. He did not preach an easy acceptance of the settlers, for the grievances were many and deep. But he spoke of understanding, of recognizing courage and honor wherever it was found, even across the painful divides of culture and blood. He spoke of Kyle. Kyle's recovery was arduous, leaving him with a fearsome scar that would forever serve as a testament to his ordeal and his love. The path ahead for him, Sarah, and young Daniel remained fraught with uncertainty. The chasm between their two peoples was wide and deep, not easily bridged by a single act of bravery, however profound. Yet, something had shifted. Kyle's sacrifice had planted a seed, a fragile bloom of hope in the harsh, unforgiving soil of the frontier. The tale of the Willow Creek warrior, who took a spear to save the settler woman and their child, rippled outwards, carried on the wind like campfire smoke. In Stone Creek Crossing, it was met with a mixture of disbelief, condemnation, and grudging admiration. Some saw only transgression, but others, those whose hearts had not been entirely hardened by the brutal realities of frontier life, saw something more, a love that defied all boundaries, a courage that stared death in the face, a sacrifice that whispered of a shared humanity often forgotten in the struggle for survival. Kyle and Sarah would continue to walk their difficult path, their hands clasped tightly, their son a living symbol of their improbable union. The frontier remained a wild, untamed place, its beauty matched only by its capacity for cruelty. But under the vast, watchful sky, in a small cabin nestled in a secluded hollow, a fragile peace had been bought with blood and courage. And Kale, the quiet warrior, knew in his scarred heart that his stand, his act of forbidden frontier love, had not been in vain. It was a testament, etched into the very soul of the land, that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not for territory or honor as the world defines it, but for the simple, sacred right to love. And in that lay a triumph that would echo through the canyons long after their bones had turned to dust.